So Joe has worked on actually a lot of things. He started out, I think, in the meteorology department in grad school.
Atmospheric science, yeah.
Okay. Studying clouds. And then he was studying a lot of complex systems at University of Illinois. And then he actually got into cultural evolution and how we actually kind of evolve our culture to deal with all our issues. And then more recently, he started a group called Earth Regenerators, and looked at kind of like the ecological, how do we organize our ecologically, and how do we organize our bioregions, and how do we, as a design thinking thing, how do we get a lot of our ecological and social issues solved by working at these local levels that are networked into larger global systems. So here we are, Joe.
Thank you. So I know that you all have something much more important to do than listen to me, which is to eat delicious food. So I apologize for interrupting with your metabolism and your digestive processes. But I just wanted to make good use of our time. So I will be happy to handle the clinking sounds on the plates if you don't mind handling chewing and swallowing a little bit while I'm getting us set up for this next part. Because, you know, for those of you who are here when we started a couple hours ago, we described how we're doing this Regenerate Cascadia activation tour and gave some sense of why we need to do this and what's going on in the world and who the heck are these people and what are we doing. And some of you have arrived a little later and didn't hear that part, but that's okay, because I'm going to give a presentation now that will lay out the whole story well enough that if there are any questions, you can come and ask me later. But what I want to really emphasize in this presentation that I'm going to give is that while I have different kinds of like academic or professional credentials, like I studied atmospheric physics at the University of Illinois, blah, 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 I want to give you my only, what I think is my only legitimate credibility for standing in front of you today, which is that I am the father of a 6.5-year-old little girl named Elise. And with what I know about the state of the world, I chose to bring a child into this world. Even though I know there's a real chance that we could have human extinction this century. So think about that. What kind of credentials would it mean to say, I believe so much in humanity, I'm putting my own skin in the game, and I'm wrapping it around the precious body of my own child? So what I want to share with you, that is written about in my book over there, and you could read it in greater depth, but rather than reading the book, I want to invite you to live it with us. Because we're actually, my book is called The Design Pathway for Regenerating Earth, and I became convinced there's only one. There's only one pathway for humans to regenerate the earth and stay a part of it. And I'll cut to the chase. You don't have to read the book. Join us on this adventure because we are living the design pathway right now, and you're already a part of it. Because we're here to talk about how to regenerate Cascadia, which is an important part of the earth. And I want to share with you some of the insights that I've gained and that I've learned from a lot of other people about how to actually do this. So if you can't see very well and you want to get a little closer for seeing the slides will really be helpful for the presentation. So if there's anyone who'd like to be able to see better, please come up closer because it'll be helpful. I want to start by drawing attention to the first image that I have here. This is a map of the watersheds of Cascadia. Anyone who wants to know more about how this map is made can talk to Brandon later. He's way back in the back. And I want to draw emphasis to the name of my talk and just go through the words. The first word is how. Not do we regenerate Cascadia, or should we, or maybe it might be interesting to talk. No, how. How do we regenerate Cascadia? So what I want to do is show you that it's possible and give you some insights into how it can actually be done. Second one is this word regenerate. Now, regenerate is one of those words that's becoming a beautiful greenwashing fluff word. Thank you, Bill Gates and others who have been greenwashing the hell out of it. But they actually can't, and they will fail, because regeneration is the dynamic pattern of any living being that reproduces the conditions of being alive moment to moment. So regeneration is the quintessential dynamic of life. So if we say, how do we regenerate Cascadia? It's how do we create the conditions conducive to life at the scale of a system of landscapes that includes more than 400 watersheds. And that's the last word, Cascadia. Cascadia is a word that has been given to this region. Brandon gave us a brief summary of it earlier today. There's a long history of this word. And if I remember correctly, its first usage for describing the bioregion as a cultural identity and political movement was 1981. So we're talking about more than 40 years that this word, many of you probably know Cascadia as a social movement, as a countercultural movement, as a different kind of economy, as a different way of organizing. I want to talk about it today in a biological sense, as the place in which living beings can flourish and survive. And so I want to talk about Cascadia as a pattern of regeneration. And so let's begin. I really like to start with this image because I want you to notice something when you look at the Earth from space. I am not the first person to make this observation, but I want you to notice there are no political boundaries. There are no divisions. This is an integrated holistic system, a living, dynamic, holistic system. Just look at the water. The ocean surrounding more than 70% of the surface. And then on the land, there are lakes and rivers. And in the air, there's water in the form of vapor and clouds. And if you just follow the water, and I were to ask you, where does the water end? It doesn't. It's completely integrated with everything that's happening. This is important because when you have a holistic living system at a planetary scale, there are certain things that become just part of life. And one of them is interdependencies that lead to systemic risk. Risks that can harm us at the scale of the entire system. In this case, at the scale of the entire planet. And so I want to talk about how this integrated whole shows us the way to regenerating Cascadia. But before I do that, I want to take the little sober moment to acknowledge where we are. And to do that, I want to talk about where we are in the process of planetary collapse. So just as a show of hands, who here has heard of the planetary boundaries? Planetary boundaries. Quite a few of you, but not everyone. Donut economics is something else. It's about the foundations of health and well-being for an economy. But Kate Raworth did help create some of the visualization of this model. Planetary boundaries is a framework developed by the Stockholm Resilience Center, a collaboration of more than 3,500 scientists who study the dynamic Earth. And in the year 2009, about 17 of these guys, these researchers who study the Earth, asked a really interesting question. They said, with everything we know about how the Earth works, are there any thresholds that if we crossed that threshold, we would leave the space of a stable planetary climate that is capable of having complex societies, empires, cities, civilizations, globalized economies? And they were like, are there any tipping points? Are there any boundaries that if we cross them, we would leave that safe space and a globalized human presence is called into question? So in 2009, they asked this question. And between 2009 and 2015, they went and gathered lots of researchers and had lots of conferences and did lots of studies, and they identified that there are 9 There are 9 boundaries of the Earth system that if you cross even one, you leave the safe space for this globalized society that we have. I'll name them for you. Climate change is only one of them. So we have this dominant discourse about climate change, which is that if you change the heat composition of the atmosphere with greenhouse gases, we all know the story. But there's another one, biosphere integrity. Biosphere integrity is the measure of the biodiversity of the planet and the rate of extinction for species that creates fragility in ecosystems at a planetary scale. So there's biosphere integrity. Then there was land system change. Land system change is if you degrade too many ecosystems. For example, if you turn them into farmland, if you turn them into cities, if you turn them into deserts. If there's too much land system change, everything unravels. Then there's freshwater use. And as Alpha was showing in his talk, only 1% of the water on Earth is freshwater. And that freshwater, which is all of the lakes and all the rivers and all the glaciers, 1% of the world's water supply. If we don't have adequate supply, or if there's too much contamination in our freshwater supply, we cross another boundary. Then there's biogeochemical flows, which refers to reactive nitrogen and phosphorus used in chemical fertilizers, which when they run into our rivers and run into our oceans, create massive dead zones. Then there's ocean acidification. If the acidity of the ocean becomes too strong, it starts to dissolve the skeletons of the organisms that live in the world ocean. Think of coral reefs made of calcium carbonate. Then there's atmospheric aerosol loading, which is a way of saying air pollution. If there's too much air pollution, it destabilizes everything. And then there's stratospheric ozone depletion. Up in the stratosphere, there's a layer of ozone that absorbs all of the dangerous ultraviolet radiation from the sun, enabling life to exist on land. And then there's this catch-all called novel entities. Novel entities is any strange chemical created by humans that the Earth doesn't know how to deal with. And so, they identified 9. If we cross even one, ooh, you feel the suspense. If we cross even one, no more planetary civilization. So there's a natural question, right? How we doing? How many have we crossed? So, in the year 2015, they published a paper showing that we had already crossed 4. Now, that doesn't mean we crossed them in 2015. It means that they asked the question, did the research, and confirmed that we had crossed the boundaries for climate change, the rate of extinction, land system change, and biogeochemical flows of nitrogen and phosphorus. But then the research continues, and the peer-reviewed papers are delayed, usually by 2 or 3 years. So, in 2021, they added 2 more: freshwater use and ocean acidification. We've already crossed these boundaries. But then the research continued, and in 2022, they added microplastics. Microplastics are in the breast milk of every woman on Earth. They're in every single water supply on Earth. Hormone disrupting and other things. And so what this tells us is that the story saying we have until 2030 to get CO2 levels down to 350 parts per million is a giant lie. The truth is, we have an integrated holistic system with multiple thresholds, and we've already crossed most of them. And this is where we are right now. So, if you look at this, do you think that changing light bulbs is going to solve it? Or do you think that going from a single occupancy vehicle with an internal combustion engine to a single occupancy vehicle with an electric battery mined from the ocean floor or from mountaintop removal is going to save us? No, we have to have a wholesale transformation of the human presence on Earth. Nothing less will do. Nothing less will do. Now I want to give an example of How does all of this work? Is that there's a body of research on what are called tipping points of the Earth system. Tipping points of the Earth system are key systems of the Earth that can have cascading consequences. I'm not going to go through all of these, but I just want to name a few of them. The boreal forest, the world's largest forest, which is all around the Arctic Circle in Eurasia and the North American continent, there could be a dieback of the boreal forest. There could be a dieback of the Amazon rainforest. There could be a shutdown of the ocean circulation in the North Atlantic, what's called the thermohaline circulation. There could be rapid melting of ice from the Greenland ice sheet. There could be the melting of permafrost in Siberia and massive release of methane. And these don't happen alone. If one of them happens, it accelerates another to happen. There are cascading consequences. And let me just show you how this works. If you look at one of them, here's one for the ice in the Arctic Ocean during the summer of the North. So the Arctic Ocean in the Northern Hemisphere has ice during the summer. But let's say that the atmosphere warms, and this warming leads to a reduction of sea ice. Sea ice reflects 90% of sunlight back into space. Ocean water absorbs 90% of sunlight. And so if you have less ice, you have a speed up, an acceleration, right? Less ice means more warming. And more warming means more ice melting. And you have a positive feedback loop. And so what happens when there's no more ice in the Arctic Ocean during the Northern Hemisphere's summer? You can look at some YouTube videos on this. It's called the Blue Ocean event. It's scheduled to happen sometime between 2024 and 2030. We're almost there. Now, how would it change all of the weather patterns on Earth if there's no more ice in the Arctic Ocean? This is a map of the jet stream. The jet stream, which is in the stratosphere, and that is what anchors our weather systems. And I want you to notice this omega, like the capital letter omega. This is the pattern that gives you rain in the Northwest during the winter. And this pattern is connected to the mixing of all of the heat in the atmosphere throughout the whole planet. So if you change the heating up here, you change the path of this, and you change your weather. So I just want you to have a feeling for how these tipping points work, because there are many, many more examples. I could go through all of the tipping points, but the important thing is this. This is our lesson. The Earth is a whole system. It's a whole system with cascading consequences. If you change one part of the Earth, you change another part of the Earth. And it does this with cascading relationships where one thing changes another, and it can happen with delays in time. I'll give you an example of a delay in time. All of the global warming we hear about is in the atmosphere, but the ocean heats much more slowly than the atmosphere. The amount of heating that has been absorbed into the ocean is typically 30 to 40 years behind where it is in the atmosphere, which means everything we're seeing with the surface warming, creating the intensified tropical storms and hurricanes, is from global warming circa 1990. All of the global warming cumulatively between then and now has not absorbed into the oceans yet, because water absorbs heat much more slowly than air. So there are time delays. So why do I say this? Because as these breakdowns unfold over space and time, we have to know how to use exactly this same information to find the silver lining. There's a silver lining. All of these interdependencies of one part of the Earth to another tell us that they are dependent on each other, which means if we can learn how to coordinate our actions across different parts of the Earth, we can re-stabilize the relationships of the Earth, which is we can use these interdependencies to restore stability to the Earth. Another way of saying this is our problem is a problem of systemic risk, which is the risk comes from the interactions of the system. What we need is systemic resilience. We need the system's response to increase our capacity to be well and to function and to survive within the dynamics of the system. So we need to know how the Earth works. Now, what's interesting about this is that as I've traveled around the world and I've visited lots of great regenerative projects, I've noticed that all of them are organized around the boundaries of a plot of land, which is to say, you go to a really great permaculture project and it's bounded by the boundaries of the land. You go to a great forest conservation project, it's bounded by the boundaries of the land. See, there are all these great projects, but they're organized at this scale. What's interesting is that every plot of land is embedded within a web of ecological relationships. There are ecological connections. For example, let's say your permaculture project is in a watershed, and there's water upstream, and someone puts pollutants into that water. They will flow across your land and then continue to flow. Every plot of land has ecological connections. Those ecological connections are organized already by the Earth into holistic landscapes. Holistic landscapes like watersheds, like coastal estuaries, like mountain ranges, like regional climate systems. They actually have an organizing pattern that is natural to them as holistic landscapes. And holistic landscapes are embedded within larger planetary processes, like the moisture that comes in from the Pacific Ocean to bring you rain. There are planetary scale processes. Now, when I was trying to find a pathway to sustainability for the planet, and I looked at any of these scales, I couldn't find it. But then I shifted my thinking and realized the answer is what happens across the scales. To focus on the relationships between the scales. When you focus on the relationships between the scales, something powerful starts to happen, is you start to see how to organize. You start to see how to cooperate. You start to see how to build systemic resilience, which is that there is no solution at any of these scales that is going to save us. The solution is to take your plot of land and your project and find out who else is connected to your land through ecological connections within a landscape, and then organize within that landscape. Following me? So, this leads to one of those really profound statements that sounds really ridiculous, which is this: everything that happens on Earth happens somewhere. Happens somewhere. So the first question is, where are we on the Earth? And look, there we are. You are here. We are part of the Earth and its relationships. And so we can work from our place to rebuild the connections to other places. There's a really profound ability to transform things by focusing on place. But there's this really problematic dichotomy, which is the dichotomy that says, what's the relationship between local and global? As if those are the only two levels. But actually, there's more than two levels, and there's this thing called translocal, which is multiple localities at the same time. Which is, I can be here in Oregon, someone else can be up in Washington, someone else can be in British Columbia, and we can collaborate within the same holistic landscape. We can be in multiple localities by having different people in different places, different projects in different places. And so, place becomes the anchor from which to rebuild resilience. So, it works like this. For any place that you might happen to be, there is a geologic history to that place. How did that place form? What kind of a place is it? Here, we're in a subduction zone on the Pacific Ring of Fire with an interior mountain range and a coastal range. Right? There's a geologic history for every place. There's also an ecological history. very strongly connected to the geology, which says what kinds of ecosystems are here, what kinds of life are here. And then when you add humans, there's a cultural history. Who are the human inhabitants of this place? How long have they been here? How did they live? Were they sustainable? Were they not sustainable? How did they do it? So every place has a story of place. And the story of place is what happens when you bring together the geologic, the ecological, and the cultural history. So what if you're not from here? What if you came from England and came to Oregon and you're new here? You're not going to someone else's story of place. You are now part of this story of place. You entered a living story. A living story. This is a living landscape. The story is not finished, which means you can start to recover the story of place and create whole system understandings of your place. Holistically, what kind of a place is this? How does health and well-being work in this place? And when you have these whole system understandings, you can start to imagine regenerative futures. You can start to imagine how the geology, the ecology, and the culture of this place can give rise to thriving and wellness in systemic ways. And then you can participate in living into those futures as part of the story of place. Place is incredibly powerful. So let's use an example. This is Eugene in Springfield. I got this image from Google Earth, and I want you to notice a pattern. Where is the degradation? Where are the destroyed landscapes? And you can see them, right? Here, 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 here. It's in the watersheds. It's in the valleys, where they've put in agriculture, where they've done industry, where they've created urban centers. So what would it mean to organize around these natural patterns? What if you started to organize a process of restoring the health and well-being of these drainages? And you start to see a little secret revealing itself, which is that the landscape will show you the way. The landscape already knows how to organize itself for life. And so what if, in this stretch here, which is maybe about 8 or 10 miles long, so you can imagine something 8 or 10, like say it's 10 miles long and 3 miles wide, you can imagine, right, someone creating an ecological restoration plan and collaborating with all the landowners and creating a framework of restoration. This is a human scale. This is a scale that you could organize a project on. You could say, what kind of an economy do we want to have? How would we do land use zoning, right? Where would we restore ecological connectivity that's broken? All of that makes sense at this scale. This is a scale that you could walk from one end to the other, like with a group of people, and you could map it out. And you could look at your progress. This is a human scale of organizing. So, what happens when you go out to a larger scale? I turn the map sideways, north is that way. This is the Willamette Valley. So you see there's Eugene and Portland, the Willamette Valley. It's ridiculously deforested, by the way. And you say, well, how would you regenerate something that large? The answer is do the same thing I showed on the previous map. So I showed it here. You go to these natural patterns of landscapes and you organize them. So you go here and you do the same thing. Like, oh, we could have a group here working on this one, a group working on that one, a group working on this one. And you start to see that in parallel, people could be doing regenerative work in multiple places, and they could regenerate the entire Willamette Valley. It's completely doable, right? And so what's interesting is we get to those nested levels of reality. Because when we go out to the Columbia Basin, the drainage of the Columbia River, and we say, where is the Willamette Valley? It's right there. See? And you start to see that reality has nested levels. Reality exists at multiple scales at the same time. And at those different scales are different ways of organizing. This map here, as Brandon and I learned yesterday, has 174 watersheds, 174 rivers that drain into the Columbia River. It's 258,000 square miles. It's huge. How would you ever regenerate that? And the answer is you divide it in sections like this, and you would organize them into human scale projects. And then you start to see how the nested levels of reality tell us how to organize ourselves up to the naturally occurring scale of an entire basin of a hydrological system, like the Columbia Basin. And this is about half the land area of the Cascadia bioregion. So you start to see the pattern language of how to do this. So if we look at all the watersheds of Cascadia, here's the Columbia River Basin right here, there's a powerful way to organize local landscapes. And so you can start to imagine a mycelial web of spreading across Cascadia. So we're on a Regenerate Cascadia tour, and we're visiting multiple places, and in each of those places they're starting to organize their landscapes, and they know that people in neighboring landscapes are doing the same thing. And then, oh, more people down over here start getting word of it, they start doing it too, and you start to see how people can organize locally and translocally at the same time. So we can say, oh, we're down here in the Eugene area in the southern part of the Willamette Valley, but this weekend we're going to Portland. So we're going to talk with the folks up there. A couple of days ago, we were in the Columbia River Gorge. Those people are starting to organize. Next week, we're going to go up to Olympia and talk to them about how to organize, and we're going to tell the same story. And we're going to start to see that people can begin to organize right now, by learning to think in this way.
Where's Eugene on that map?
Eugene on this map, this is the Willamette Valley, so Eugene would be down here somewhere. Not sure exactly, but somewhere close to there, wherever the McKinsey and the Middle Willamette come together. And so you can start to see, because this is this map. This goes all the way up to southern Alaska and comes down. So you can see how this is a way of seeing the world. It's a way of seeing the world that tells us what to do. So if we want to regenerate our bioregions, we need to know how. How do you regenerate a bioregion? So I'm going to give you the shorthand version, because of course, we're actually going to figure it out by doing it. No one's ever really done this before. But we can start to look at what are the structures that you need to put in place for bioregional regeneration at this scale to work. And okay, we can go back to how do we organize around land again. And we start to see there are some really key things we need. One thing we need is bioregional learning centers. We need places that gather all of that knowledge about the place and make it available and integrate it and connect it. We have to create different models of education, different ways of understanding native plants, zones of fire risk, the cultural history of the First Nations people, collaboration with them, obviously. And there's a bioregional learning dimension. We need to create bioregional learning centers. There are a lot of learning centers, like this one here at Lost Valley, that already do a lot of things that are bioregional learning, right? We're not starting from scratch. It's a way of thinking about how to organize our knowledge. And then with these bioregional learning centers, we need to create our own forms of territorial governance. We have to be able to make decisions together around our place. We need to be able to mobilize resources into our place. We need to set criteria and priorities, collective visioning, scenarios for the future. How do we want our place to be, and what's most important to us, and where do we put our investments? By the way, investments is a lot more than money. I mentioned at the beginning, I've got a 6-year-old daughter. I lived in Eugene when she was a year old. She couldn't breathe the air for 2 months. We moved to Costa Rica. Then we later moved to Colombia, and now we're doing bioregional regeneration there. And so where you invest is a question of belonging. It's a deep, deep human question. So territorial governance is what emerges when we start making decisions together in our place. Then we need to map out the local projects and weave them into tapestries. And we need to create ecosystems of learning from all the learning that exists. It's like, oh, there are all these great learning centers, all these eco-villages, all these permaculture projects. What if we start mapping them so that they can govern themselves collectively in service to the regeneration of landscapes? And then we're on our way to regenerating our bioregion. And at the foundation of all of this is the design of pro-social contexts, which is to say we have to find shared identity and purpose. We have to create equitable distribution of benefits and contributions. We have to have fast and fair conflict resolution. We need to have psychological flexibility to change our perspectives and be open to new things. We need trauma healing and grief work to enable us to come together in difficult times. We have to design for collective impact. We have to say, my job in this context is to work with others to do something I can't do on my own. So we have to be pro-social. We have to be proactively cooperative, generous, altruistic, supportive around shared purpose. Shared purpose such as, I want the salmon to run in this river again, right? Shared purpose. And the design of pro-social context runs across all of this. And so this leads us back to the idea of a bioregion. You can't regenerate a bioregion unless we have some basic agreement on what a bioregion is. So I'm going to go really basic. The word bioregion is just short for two words, biological region. So a biological region is the geographic space in which the entire life system can exist for a population of any species. Right, you can have a bioregion for fish, you can have a bioregion for butterflies, of course you can have a bioregion for humans. So I like to say this is the entire life context. And I like to use starfish as my example because it's an easy one to visualize. What's the bioregion for starfish? And the answer is the intertidal zone. If you go out here to the Oregon coast where there are tide pools, there's high tide and there's low tide, and there's a space in between, and that defines the geography for the entire life system of starfish. Which is to say a biological region or a bioregion is the whole context for life for that organism. Now you notice that's a lot easier to say where the boundaries are for a starfish than it is for humans. Right? Human bioregions involve cultural identity, model of social organization, cosmovision and worldview, political structures, technology, which changes social organization, extent of trade networks, and you start to see that human bioregions are much more complex. But a good first approximation is the ancestral homelands of the indigenous people. It's a good first approximation. What were the extended trade networks of a language family of an indigenous group? Or in a network of indigenous groups. And you start to see the whole life context of their economies. And you start to see that the only thing that could be a regenerative human economy is by definition bioregional. Because the bioregion is the whole life context. So with this in mind, we can see something really interesting is that each bioregion is actually the whole system model, which is it's the model that represents the whole system for creating these living patterns. And so what's interesting about this is we can now imagine a planetary network of bioregions. What if all humans on Earth reorganized into bioregions? What if we formed networks of learning and exchange? What if we had sibling bioregions, as our friend Keala was saying? Where it's like our bioregion is similar to this one, we need to learn together. And we create a planetary network of bioregions. And we learn together how to do this in all of the different parts of the world. So see, this is what needs to happen. It's simple to say. Right? We have to recreate the conditions conducive to life. That means recreate the conditions for living locally in terms of material flows, integrated life systems, the thriving of families and communities, you know, the basics, right? We have to create these local living economies. What's interesting is if you look at a map like this one, which is a map of ecotypes or type of ecosystems, each color represents a different kind of ecosystem. There's diversity, which means we should expect there to be a diversity of human cultures and a diversity of human economies, each one organized around its own landscape. And this is actually what was found by a group, an obscure group to those today, called the Balaton group. Balaton is the name of the largest lake in Europe, Lake Balaton, which is in Hungary. And the Balaton group was a learning community of people in the 1970s who came together after a famous report was issued in 1972 called Limits to Growth. Limits to Growth was a computer simulation of different scenarios of the future that showed how the exact collapse we're living through now, which is happening right on schedule, what they called business as usual, that's where that phrase comes from, was one of their scenarios, the Limits to Growth study. And after that study, they said, how do we live on a finite planet? And some of the greatest minds of that time started gathering and having meetings at different universities and different retreat centers and different monasteries and spiritual places. And between 1972 and 1982, the Balaton Group had meetings all over the world. And in 1983, the lead author of Limits to Growth, Dana Meadows, wrote a little essay called A Brief History of the Balaton Group. And this is a quote from that essay from Vernon Rutten, who is a member of the Balaton Group. He said this: each agroeconomic region is so unique that the concept of transfer of technology is irrelevant. What's relevant is the transfer of the capacity to develop technology and institutions that are consistent with the cultural endowment and resource endowment of each place, which is each place needs to build its own institutional framework to manage itself. And then Dana went on to say, out of these 10 years of conversations came a vision of a number of centers where information and models about resources and the environment are housed. There would need to be many of these centers all over the world, each one responsible for a distinct bioregion. Dana Meadows said this in 1983, 40 years ago. I was born in 1976, so I was like 6 years old when this came out. Notice how this is not measuring the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and being sure capitalism profits with techno-fix solutions. All of that happened starting in 1987, when they created this huge reductionism of the environmental discourse. So a question, has anyone come up with a better solution than this to get to planetary sustainability since 1983? Nope. This is the only way. The only way is to organize ourselves around local living economies, organized as bioregions, where each bioregion has its own bioregional learning centers, its own networks of learning about how to live in that place. 40 years ago, this was discovered. So, here's a little example of how we're doing it in another place. This is a topographic map of the country of Colombia. This is the northern Andes. And this is where I live. I live right here, in a place called Barichara, Colombia. And we have a well-defined regional climate system. Between these three lines of mountains, there's a circulation of air that creates a regional climate system. It's about 500,000 hectares in size, or about 1 million acres. It's got a unique ecosystem, unlike any other on Earth, called the High Andes Tropical Dry Forest. And 80% of the species are endemic. They exist nowhere else on Earth. That forest is also more than 95% deforested for agriculture, for monoculture crops in the last 80 years. So the whole region's becoming a desert. That's Barichara right there. As a tourism destination, it's called the prettiest town in Colombia, and I think that's probably true. It's absolutely gorgeous there. This is a picture that I took from Bioparque Moncora, which is a community reforestation project that's on the edge of the town, where a lot of the children go to learn about the native trees and practice reforestation. And I just want to show you some of the examples of how is this happening in practice. So one thing is, when I arrived in Barichara in 2019, I started doing the permaculture thing, which is observe the local patterns without intervening and see what's there. And I started seeing there were a lot of really good projects. They were moving along just fine, but they were isolated and fragmented from each other. So the question became, how do we weave them together? So I started creating a design school for healing the entire landscape by identifying where these projects exist on the land and looking at their relationships through the drainage of water, through ecological connectivity, through the formation of clouds and the movement of air. And we started to see that there are ways of organizing these projects within the landscape. We did this with 4 key patterns. I know this is hard to read, so I apologize, but I'll summarize it. We identified 4 key territorial scale patterns that we could work with. The first one was restoration of entire watersheds. In the landscape of Barichara, every river is dead. Every river is dead. Either there's no water that runs in it at all, or it's so contaminated that nothing can live. This is true all across Latin America, actually. But where we are, there are 0 living rivers. So restoration of entire watersheds means setting up community water councils, creating member-owned aqueducts to manage the water, engaging in reforestation, soil building, doing things that would restore the watersheds. Second thing is that we created a learning center in syntropic agroforestry, which is how do we reforest these barren landscapes so that they create food to eat, medicinal plants, textiles from natural fibers, construction materials, everything we'd need for a human economy that's entirely localized. So we started creating pilot projects and demonstration sites for syntropic agroforestry, having learning exchanges across private land embedded within larger patterns of the landscape. And one of the focal points of this is transformation of local food systems, that we need to get as close as we can to 100% food security within 10 kilometers of our town in every direction. Luckily, Barichara is already about 70%. Yeah, for those of you who know about food systems, that's insane, because most places are well less than 3%. Food sheds around, our population is 6,000 people in the town. It's much smaller than big urban centers, but still 70% of the food is grown within walking distance that you could carry it on your back or with a mule in a day and get it to market. So transformation of local food systems is creating exchanges between local growers, creating market systems for them, and this leads to the fourth one, which is design of alternative economic models. Creating solidarity exchanges between people, creating community marketplaces, design of community currencies, community funds and philanthropy for mobilizing resources, and all of these things are happening in the community. And so these are 4 patterns. There are actually more than this that we're working with, but you can start to see how you can organize your own landscape. Organize it around food systems, organize it around the restoration of watersheds, organize it around different kinds of economic models, organize it around different kinds of education. Oh, silly software update, go away. So, this is an example of a different kind of education. This is Felipe. He started a project called Pasos de Agua. Pasos de Agua is Spanish for the steps of water, the steps that water takes. Pasos de Agua is a very simple but powerful idea. Like I said, all of our rivers are dead, including the Barichara River. So he started organizing caminatas del agua, water walks, to have the children walk along the drainages of the watershed and get permission first from the landowners, and then have the children between the ages of 4 and 10 years old, having the children interview the adults and ask them what happened to the water, to cultivate conscience in the adults. And then they would gather with indigenous elders, other adults with expertise, and bring community guidance and support to the children. And then the children do things like this 6-year-old girl, Quetzal, who's offering her policy proposals for how to restore the Barichara River. You can't read it here, but one of the things on the list is to create bales of hay and inoculate them with mushrooms and do microfiltration of the water to remove the contaminants, because she saw it on YouTube. Quetzal. This is another pattern that's really important to us. This is Gabriella and her granddaughter Soraya. One of our principles that we have in Barichara is whenever possible, when there's an important conversation to be had, we make sure that the children are playing in the center of the circle with the adults, so that the children will remember what the grown-ups talked about, and the adults will be immediately accountable to the integrity of their own futures. There are so many ways to change education. Now, what's interesting is when we start to really look at this work in more detail, you can see here's Bioparque Moncora. That's Camila, this wonderful 72-year-old woman who has been leading reforestation work with children for about 15 years. And Bioparque Moncor is right here. What's interesting is we have other projects that are nearby, even if they didn't know about each other. When I arrived in Barichara, this project did not know about that project. You can walk from one to the other in less than 10 minutes. This is Fundación Montechico, where they engage in preservation of cultural knowledge about native plants and how to create natural fibers and textiles, with workshops in bioconstruction and textiles and agroforestry. And it's like less than 10 minutes walk from Bioparque Moncor. It's doing community reforestation of native trees. And because Colombia has a long history of violence, people didn't trust each other. They didn't talk to each other. It took the gringo from the outside to come and help them build trust with each other. It's so ironic. Don't you think? Oh, sorry, bad Alanis Morissette joke. This is Barichara right here. This is the town of Barichara. So these are in the town. And so you can start to see that the land shows us how to organize. And so if you take a collection of projects like these, I know you can't read the names, but each of these are different projects we're working with. So like, this is Caneco Libri, which is a community theater for teaching children indigenous cosmovillage vision and nature connection. This is Agua Santa, which is a 14-hectare regenerative agriculture project. Corasoma, which is trauma healing for women, and on and on. And you look at them and like, just put them on a page like this, you can't see how they relate to each other. Like, how would you organize them? You wouldn't even know. But if you look at where they sit in the land, you start to see patterns of activity that you can do. To have the community theater connected to the regenerative agriculture, connected to the watershed restoration, because they're all in the same drainage. The land holds the complexity for us. You can also see how deforested the plateau is in this picture. So what this means is we need to think differently about things like education. And I'm just going to say this point blank, everything about regeneration is education. There's nothing that's not connected to education. So how does a bioregional learning center work? For one thing, it creates coordination of learning processes. There are lots of learning processes in the community, but they're fragmented and isolated. We have to get them coordinating with each other. There's mapping and knowledge sharing. And I don't just mean like geographic mapping. There can be community asset mapping. There can be institutional mapping. There can be mapping of donors for resources. You can do all kinds of mapping and knowledge sharing, right? So mapping and knowledge sharing is about learning about your place. It's also a gateway into community activities. What this means is if someone comes to your bioregion from the outside, it's good for there to be one entry door and one welcome desk, and they show up and say, I'm interested in trauma healing. Oh, talk to these people. I'm interested in reforestation. Talk to these people. To have a gateway into the education ecosystem, which is why we call it a bioregional learning center. You can have advanced modeling and simulation like we have at our best universities and research laboratories. You can do modeling and simulation of the big earthquake or of the tidal movements with sea level rise. All these things that we do, the advanced research and learning can be rethought of in this framework and still exist. You can have indigenous perspectives and the decolonization of education. I would argue you must have this. But you can see that this would be part of bioregional learning. And then you can have both centralized and decentralized components. You can have storehouses of knowledge coordinated in a centralized fashion to enable you to decentralize the management and the allocation of resources. So this is just, there's more to bioregional learning centers than this, but I just want you to see how you can start thinking about what you already have in your community and how to organize it differently. When we look at territorial governance, we can do the same thing. You can map and weave local projects. How is this governance? Well, if you start gathering the projects, the representatives of the projects, and bring them into collaboration, they need to set agendas together. They need to have criteria and priorities and a shared purpose, and they need to know how to allocate resources. They're practicing governance. You can identify needs as a community, like in Barichara, we need to be storing the water and recharging the aquifers. We need to be restoring the forest. So there are priorities that are community-wide. And as a group, as representatives, like what's called a multi-stakeholder collaboration, people representing different projects, they can come together and identify priorities. They can form landscape partnerships, which is we're going to come together and manage this fishery. We're going to come together and manage this river. We're going to come together and manage this forest. You might notice a lot of this already exists. You can create community funding structures, which is you can identify your resources, not just money, but knowledge, time, experience, tools, and material, and the things that you would need to mobilize. And you can create community partnerships and collaborations about how to allocate them, like seed sharing, for example. You can mobilize resources in service to the whole, which is to say, you don't mobilize resources to your own project. You mobilize resources so that your project can serve the whole, which means you need to have a collective understanding of the whole, which is why you need the mapping and the partnerships. And this is what enables you to cultivate local sovereignty. Local sovereignty is not given by a king on high or coming from a sword in the lake, as you know, Excalibur. Sovereignty comes from people taking control of what they're responsible for and stewarding it wisely. Sovereignty is earned. It's earned. The Kogi people of Santa Marta in Colombia have a saying: if you want to know the conscience of the people, visit their water. So when they arrive to a village, before they start a conversation, they go and look at the river, and they assess the consciousness of the people. Just for the record, in Barichara, 100% of the toilet water is dumped completely unprocessed out of a tube over a 400-foot waterfall at the bottom of the town because of local corruption. Now, is that the fault of the mayor? No, because all of the people are allowing it to happen. You can see the level of conscience and the level of sovereignty in what people do with their water. And this strengthens collaboration internally within the community. So territorial governance is built from the ground up. It's built from the ground up. Now I want to share with you a model for how to fund all of this, how to think about this from a financing point of view. This is a model developed by Common Land Foundation, which is based in the Netherlands. They work on projects all around the world that are at least 100,000 hectares in size and that last for 20 years or longer. And what they realized in working on projects around the world was that you have to think of these projects, first of all, you have to recognize that most of the people with money are ecological idiots. So you have to translate what you're talking about into a language they can understand, or else they're not going to give you the money you need to do what you're going to do. And the other thing they realized was that the scale they're talking about to create regenerative economies at the scale of landscapes, which is hundreds of millions to billions of dollars, like how would you ever get that funded? Well, a good thing to do is say, well, has anyone ever funded projects on that scale? And the answer is yes. Think of the regional, I don't know, like think of the light rail system around Portland. How much did it cost? $1 billion? Something like that? So the insight that Willem Verweerde, the founder of Common Land Foundation, the insight he had was to structure your landscape plan the way you would structure an infrastructure project. An infrastructure project like a transit system. You say, oh, well, you need a project management team that manages all the processes from beginning to end. Right? You need someone that does hiring, someone that does the legal work, someone that makes sure they've done the contracting, someone who's doing the sourcing of materials. So whatever the processes are you need to manage, you need to fund the core team that manages that. So if you want to regenerate a watershed, you need to fund the core team that's managing the process, and you fund them for 20 years or longer. And what they found in practice is it's between $2 and $5 million per year, which means you need $100 million just for your core team to regenerate a watershed or a large-scale landscape feature. What's interesting about this is that this is so obvious, right? Like, if no one's managing it, how's it going to happen? Right? It's got to be able to be coordinated. But then there's this green part. The green part is public goods infrastructure, which is the things that are built that don't create a financial return because they enable the whole economic system to work. For example, you fund public education so that you have an educated workforce, right? That's public goods. It's things that you invest in so the public can work. So what they found in practice is that you need at least twice as much money per year for your landscape to fund all of the regenerative projects and the coordination among them, coordinated with the help of the core team, that's the landscape team managing the process. And what happens is after about 8 to 10 years, your regenerative businesses start to become viable because you've built enough of a market ecosystem that functions with the landscape. They also found in practice that the governments that are involved, the local and regional governments, have no clue how this works, so they don't fund anything until after they get a tax base from the regenerative businesses, which means you can expect them not to support anything because they don't understand it. This is what they found in practice. Now, luckily, this model has been applied in about 15 landscapes around the world. The largest one is in Andalusia in Spain. It's over a million hectares of land, completely destroyed by the Roman Empire. It's been turned into desert, and they're trying to set up regenerative agriculture systems there. And so they now have more than 10 years of financial data on these kinds of investments to show this is a viable investment vehicle. So what's interesting about this is that if we're going to have bioregional governance, we have to think about the governance in a legitimate way, which is we have to think about, we have to fund the key processes that allow us to build the economy that we need. And it's going to take time. And the time frame has two magic numbers: 8 to 10 years before you start to have a regenerative economy, and 20 years or longer before the whole landscape system starts to look healthy. Which doesn't mean it's done regenerating. It's just that it's in a place where it's going to continue. So if you think of something like, we want to restore the Willamette Valley, which is a very large-scale system, you need to be able to have a landscape management team, a way of mapping out and sourcing and funding the public goods infrastructure of all of your regenerative projects so that a different kind of economic system can emerge. So there's clarity like this that can guide us in bioregional regeneration. This leads to a really powerful idea developed by my friend Stuart Cowan, create a bioregional investment platform. So a bioregional investment platform is a portfolio of projects organized around a holistic landscape. And then you create robust circulation of values and exchanges between those projects. You de-risk the investment by funding 20 projects at once and their coordination. And if you do that, so this is the paradox. It's really hard to find tiny bits of money when everyone's competing. It's actually much easier to find huge amounts of money when everyone's cooperating. And actually, there's about $2 trillion sitting in the carbon markets right now. The carbon markets are mostly a sham, but at least it's a huge pool of money. The reason that money cannot go anywhere is because they do not have verified organizing capacity for large-scale landscapes at the scale of 100,000 hectares or larger that can mobilize hundreds of millions of dollars at a time. It is illegal to move the money because the people managing the money are responsible to someone else. Think of like pension funds, where if you had to manage a pension fund, you are legally responsible to be very careful about how you manage someone else's money. These huge pools of money have legal requirements to manage risk. And they cannot move because there is not local organizing sufficiently large to mobilize the money. Just ask yourself, if you personally received $100 million to restore a watershed tomorrow, would you be able to go out and just do the contracts and pay everyone to do it? It's not organized. It's not organized. And so we need to build up our bioregional investment platforms. And the way we start is by having a shared vision and starting to map and weave local projects. So this gets you to something that's like a recipe. It's not exactly a recipe, but you can see the basic building blocks. Is to do bioregional regeneration, you need bioregional learning centers. And you need territorial governance. And you need integrated landscape management. You have to manage the landscape as a whole. And then create robust circulation of value across all of them so that they are an entire platform system. They all function together. And then you see things like, oh, this means we weave the people in projects, right? That's not too hard to understand. We grow our cooperative abilities, and then we deepen our organizing capacities by cooperating, and that's how we birth a regenerative economy. But the scale is what matters. You can't birth a regenerative economy at a scale that's too small for the regenerative process. And the scale is the definition, right? It's the life context for the whole thing, which is the bioregion. And so then you can look at things like, this is the Salish Sea with its watersheds. And like, we could do this for each one of those, right? You can start to see how it can be done. And what's interesting is, if you look at something like the mapping of language families of indigenous peoples, you might notice they don't correspond exactly to the watersheds, but kind of close, because people don't cross over high peaks to get to the other side. And the exchange and trade naturally self-organizes to the landscape scale. So if we're doing this work with all of these First Nations people still here, they're all still here, they probably want this kind of an economy too. There's huge opportunities for not only reconciliation, but transformation. And I want to name something really important, because I've been talking with indigenous leaders around the world, and there's this language that we need to develop. A language we have to develop. First of all, we have to stop idolizing indigenous people as if they're not humans. That's ridiculous, and it doesn't honor anyone. The other thing we have to realize is pretty much everything we know about indigenous people existed in the Holocene. Newsflash, no more Holocene, it's over. The Holocene is over. We do not know for sure that any of the practices of indigenous people are adapted to the future that's coming. So, we have to enter into the new world to become the future indigenous. The future indigenous brings together the best of our knowledge and wisdom traditions, traditional ecological knowledge of indigenous cultures around the world, together with the best of science and the best of what we've learned about the planet. Because no indigenous culture in history ever had to manage the planet. They existed within territories. This is the first time we need to be indigenous at a planetary scale. The language that the Kogis have is they call this the third world. The first world is the ancestral pathways, the lifeways of indigenous people from the past and those present. The second world is the world of modernity, the world that created new knowledge, created things like science, and it created a huge amount of insights about the planet. It put satellites in space to monitor weather. The third world is the world that no one has been in before, that we must create now. The third world brings the best of the first two worlds forward. So, here we are on a Regenerate Cascadia tour, and now you can start to see the reasoning behind this. So earlier this week, we started on the Columbia River Gorge. Now we're here in Eugene in this area. This weekend we go to Portland. Then we're going to go up to Olympia, then to Vashon Island, then to Seattle, then to Whidbey Island. We're going to continue around the loop, and in 30 days, we're going to have this same conversation in all of these places. To encourage everyone to start thinking this way for their own place and for the other places. So that you can collaborate with people in Portland after this weekend. You can collaborate with people in Olympia after next Wednesday. So the idea of this activation tour, where we're doing all this travel in a month, is to create the same conversation in multiple places. And then the work begins. Because the real work is, how do we live this out? And so you can start to see it now at a larger scale, right? Here's the North American continent, organized around watersheds. So back in January and early February, Penny and I, she's right up there, we went and did an activation tour in the Great Lakes. Yeah, it was in January and February, minus 27 Celsius. It was cold. But we were in the greater Takaranto bioregion, which is a land system in southern Ontario. We were in the Finger Lakes and Genesee River in upstate New York, and we were in the Cuyahoga River in northeastern Ohio. So in like 2 weeks, we experimented and did some things. And so the Great Lakes is starting to organize this way. In May, we did a trip from the headwaters to the Sea of Cortez in the Colorado Basin. And landscape leaders from different parts of the Colorado Basin had a retreat in Paonia, Colorado 2 weeks ago, after we started organizing this with them 3 months ago. Here we are with you guys now in Cascadia. You start to see how we regenerate a continent. We already have conversations bubbling up in the Ogallala Aquifer, in the Driftless region in Wisconsin, and other parts of the middle of the continent in the Mississippi Basin. And we start to see that the same way of thinking applies to all of them. This is how we regenerate the earth. Place by place, with each place carrying its own load and helping the other places. And you guys in Cascadia have a responsibility, because Cascadia is the oldest and strongest bioregional identity on the planet. You have a responsibility to show people in other parts of the world how to do this. And so this is how we create bioregional networks in every continent. We might give Antarctica a pass for now. We got enough to handle. But this is how we do it. The logic is so clear. We organize around landscapes. And so that's why we created the Design School for Regenerating Earth, where we're building a planetary network of bioregions. See, it says right here, people all over the world are gathering to regenerate the Earth at the bioregional scale and organize into a planetary network of learning exchanges between landscapes. So the Design School for Regenerating Earth, which was born March 1st of this year, and you are already in the Design School, because we're here talking about how to regenerate Cascadia together. You can also join the Design School and participate in these learning exchanges. And so you can join the Design School. You can read my book. It's back in the back. I don't really have good slides about what we're doing with Cascadia from here, but I'll stop there and just say, if we're going to regenerate Cascadia, it's going to be because we put different eyes into our heads and we open up the hearts we already have. Just we have to see these nested levels of reality together. We have to see them together. And as we do that, we will begin to believe together. And if we don't believe it can be done, and this is probably the scariest thing, if we don't believe it can be done, it will not happen. And even if we do believe, it still may not happen. This is hard. But this is the moment we're in. Remember those planetary boundaries? Remember those tipping points? Remember that feeling in your stomach? We're here. We're here right now. We're in that place. And this is the work. The work now is to reintegrate human consciousness and action into the living systems of our own places. It's spiritual work. So thank you for listening. Thank you for being part of this with us. I'm happy to answer some questions. Afterwards, I'll also be back at the back. And I want to draw attention to the nice man in the black hat, Brandon Letzinger. He's going to be back there because he can talk to you about the Regenerate Cascadia Summit that's going to be in the beginning of November and some other steps we're taking to organize all of this, because we're not just traveling around giving talks. It's too late for that. It's time to organize. It's time to mobilize resources, and it's time to get this done. And so, Brandon will tell you all about it. You want to share a comment or two?
Penny, yeah, come up in front.
Oh yeah, no, well I was just going to say actually, I would like to actually just take a minute, because then what I think was beautiful is we have this planetary scale, So our challenge with Regenerate Cascadia is going to be how do we create Cascadia as a node as part of this planetary network. And what I'd really like to do is actually just take a minute, and I'd like to have Alpha and Tanya and Christine and Mike maybe raise their hands, because these are the people who have been kind of holding it down for Eugene and Lost Valley.
Helping us organize all of this.
And they've organized all of this. So I think if you want to get involved, go find one of them, go talk to them. And this is just the start.
Could you guys stand up, actually, so everyone can see?
Yeah. And this is just the start, and I think this is where we really start to think of ourselves that, 40 years ago, Cascadia got started because a bunch of people got together, and in 1986, 150 people gathered at Evergreen State College to envision what a Cascadia Bioregional Congress could look like. As people came as delegates of their watersheds, as delegates of animals. And I'd love for everybody in this room to think about what would it look like if everybody came as delegates for a Eugene watershed Congress, for a Lost Valley Congress, and then as part of a larger building bioregional Congress, and where we all have the power to kind of help shape that governance and these things. And so I think just moving forward, absolutely come find me. We're gonna be traveling around. We're gonna have an online summit that everybody's invited to, but then also connect with these four, and these four are gonna be helping to continue it forward here in Eugene and Lost Valley. And so get involved. And what's amazing is people are already thinking about, do you have a monthly meeting that starts to bring these things together? How do you want to meet? And that is for you all to decide. So.
Yeah, and just to draw attention real quick, if you have friends who live in any of these places, tell them to go to regeneratecascadia.org and meet us on the road, because we're going to be doing this in the next few weeks.
I was wondering if we could just open up to the room if people have ideas of how some of the next steps of how we organize here in Eugene. Regenerate. Yeah.
Well, I'm probably loud enough. So I mentioned this a few times. There's a little store in Eugene called Eugene Backyard Farmer, and there's a community seed exchange there. I'm passionate about seeds, but people are probably sick of hearing me talk about them. But it's really simple. There's 3 boxes there with about 150 different kinds of seeds. Just come down Eugene Backyard Farmer, take some seed, plant it, and if something grows, bring some seed back. I see seeds as a really pivotal community resource.
And we're all seeds.
That's true. There's a great saying about it. I cannot think about it. Anyway, I don't know.
Cool. Thanks.
Yes, thank you.
So thank you, everyone, for your attention. I'm going to be back here at the back if anyone wants to come and hang out with me. I do have books that are for sale, and they actually will help cover the costs of our gas and our travel for this trip. So you could totally do that if you want. You can also sign up for regeneratecascadia.org and get involved in the organizing, or just come to the events, or join the summit. They also have a movement map on their website for us to see each other. So there's some really cool things on the website to check out. Yeah, and if you want to join the design school and get involved at that level, we'll be back over there. But it looks like Quinn's got something. Come on in.
So
The mic is for recording for the video. It's like you can't hear it.
I've heard this talk a couple times, so I've had some time to process and think about what to do, and I'm in a unique position where I can kind of try to take a couple bites out of this bioregional education piece. I'm probably going to be following a lot of the tours, so what I want to do is focus on building capacity for specifically young adults in their bioregional learning journeys, which is like, regenerative education, community-based, place-based, intergenerational learning. And the way I want to try to do it is by kind of gathering the contacts of different people that would be, young adult learners that are maybe just coming out of high school and, in their 20s or something, and then find those people, find the local watershed leaders the type of people who have a good sense of a lot of stuff that's going on, and maybe a group of those folks, and then also folks that can, be the people who can be teachers and share their skills and have projects that they're working on that can help those young people really root into their place and learn in that embodied way. So as I go along, let's say there's 20 young people that I find in all different watersheds to bring together kind of like a cohort and have it be housed in the design school as well as like physically in all these landscapes. I think it could really support a lot of folks that are seeking this path. So if you're any of those people, know some young people, know some landscape leaders, know some people who can share their projects and their skills and their knowledge, or you are that person, come find me and I'm just gonna write your name down and we'll send out some email or something. So, yeah.
Cool, thanks, Quinn. I mean, the real beauty of this is that we really, like I said, we start right now. There's no need to wait because there's already so much happening. So I want to give us a chance to sort of like absorb and take this in, have conversations. And what I hope is going to happen from this is that we planted a little dream together in this room and that it can take root and grow. Because this is the dream that I think we've all been waiting for. Not because I said it, but because the earth is manifesting it. It is happening all around us. It is happening within us. It's incredible. And it's a little late, isn't it? It's like, fuck, it's time to do this. So with that, thank you, everyone. And there we go.